was such an outsider that nobody knew me. And there's Richmond, and this is what they do all the time. They're always destroying each other. And it was like, well, I just don't think that's going to happen. The fundamentals are right. You give people a chance. Why don't we see this through?
In the West Virginian mountain town of Killarney in the 1950s, the 30-odd local families had a daily challenge to contend with. The kids had to dart across the busy train tracks to get to school. It went like this. All the mothers would keep watch and yell, "Go!" when it was safe. And all the school children would hastily scramble under the train and over the tracks to the 2-room schoolhouse on the other side. Now, Killarney doesn't even exist anymore. The company town closed along with the mine. But I reckon the lessons young Peggy O'Neal learned there must have really stayed with her. She's this incredibly determined and deliberate Richmond Football Club president and lawyer, and she's been rallying her community around her, surveying the risks, and taking those calculated leaps into the unknown ever since. I'm Kelly Reardon, and from Dead Set Studios, this is Curveball, the show where exceptional leaders talk about the challenges that have made them. Now, you're most likely to know Peggy O'Neal as the president of Richmond Football Club. She was there before they won that drought-breaking grand final against Adelaide in 2017. She's actually the first woman ever to become president of an AFL club. She's seen off coups and criticism, and she's done it with a steady hand and a steeliness forged in boardrooms and law firms. Peggy O'Neal, welcome to Curveball.
Thank you, Kelly.
Australian football clubs, and law firms for that matter, are famously tough environments, but that sort of rough and tumble doesn't seem to be your style. You're much more known for that deliberate, collaborative mindset. Have you always been like that, or is that something you had to teach yourself?
I can't say that I was ever someone who was quick to anger or quick to heightened emotions, and maybe that sort of steered me to a legal career where people get frustrated when lawyers say, well, it depends, or there's the other side, or there's the this. So I guess maybe I always pause and think, maybe I've got this right, maybe I don't. So let me just think about it. Let me just hear what they have to say.
You were born a coal miner's daughter in a very tiny town in West Virginia. What could you see when you stepped out the front door in those early days?
Mountains and more mountains, and coal miners coming home from work, and coal cars on those train tracks that you just mentioned. Coal was what drove the meager economy that was there at the time. So I was just surrounded by people who were working hard, basically doing it tough, trying to raise a family in the only way that you could. Those were very secure jobs at the time. And then, of course, things changed. But it was also very close, and you knew everyone, and everybody knew you, and if you did something wrong, your mother found out before you got home. But I remember we didn't have telephones. I probably was 12 years old before we ever had a telephone. So you just sort of think about relying on each other. There's a big self-reliance, but if you needed help, the only people you could really go to were your neighbors in your community.
And what was school like for you?
I started school a year early, and first grade to fourth grade was in one room, and fourth to seventh was in another room. And most everybody, except for babies, most everyone, the 20 kids or so, were in school. And I remember the teacher of the first to fourth grade said, well, she might as well come, all her playmates are all at school. And I went, and I remember saying, but I don't know how to read yet. And they said, it's what we teach you. And I just loved it. And I've only thought more about it because it now seems so different to what people do now. But at the time, it was what I knew, and I didn't know that people went to school differently for many, many years after that. It's a romantic sort of notion for some people, but it was tough for the people who lived there.
It was quite rustic.
It was one tiny little road over the hill, and it was remote, and you had to figure things out for yourself.
And an outdoor toilet?
Well, the school did. We had one of the new houses in the coal camp, but we had an indoor toilet at home. We were one of the few, but at school, all these little kids, and we had to use the outdoor toilet, and so you had a buddy that went with you to hold you on so that you didn't fall in. But most people, that's what they had at home, so they were pretty adept at handling the outdoor toilet at school.
Your parents were clearly quite extraordinary, though. They're in this small town, 2 girls, but they had quite high hopes for you and your sister.
Well, they did. They were both very intelligent people, even if they weren't, highly educated people. And my mother, I think, especially wanted us to have opportunities. And she was a great one to remind us that, education can change your life in a generation. Education is the thing. Education is the thing. And it was such a thing that was denied her, and she placed such importance on it. And she was very, very bright. So that was her big drive, was for us to be educated. And it never occurred to me that we wouldn't be. And looking back at, my cousins and other people around the place at the time, I think it was very unusual for her to have that drive for us, because a lot of people just assumed we would all stay where we were, and the next generation would be like the previous generation. And then, of course, things in the economy and things changed all of that. But she never lost sight of that. Get your education, you can take care of yourself.
So you're living in this tiny remote town. It's freezing cold as well. School has an outdoor toilet. Even though your parents were opening your eyes to what was possible via education, did you have a feeling that you were less than, or you had less than other people?
Well, no. There hadn't been that exposure to the wider world, I suppose. Once I started reading, then you started thinking, well, how do you get there? Or who are those people, and how do they live that way and I live this way? But it was more I guess it was almost fairy tale-like in the sense that I knew deeply where I was, but I hadn't had any exposure to the wider world. Then, of course, when things modernized and television and we moved to a slightly larger town, and we had a library and more books and all of that, I just was thirsty for as much as I could soak up. And that's when I started thinking about that wider world. But at the same time, I didn't think I was really denied anything. We didn't have a ballet school, and we didn't have a museum, and we didn't have an art gallery. But we had a lot of freedom, and we had a lot of security in the sense of great parenting and good teachers. It's surprising how good the teachers were in those little schools. So I didn't really think I missed anything, probably for a long time, until maybe when I was first practicing law.
Mm-hmm. You went to university, one of the first in your family to do so, to study law. And I imagine that that's a time when you suddenly land in a place where you're exposed to not just ideas, but also the sense that other people come from other backgrounds. And I think you were at a university that was had a lot of families that were well-to-do. Was that quite a contrast for you?
Yeah, it was. And it was pretty overwhelming at the beginning. And you start to doubt, well, can I keep up? And what do they know that I don't know? And I must say it was a real time to pause and to think, my confidence is a bit shaken here. But then I kept telling myself, well, there's only sort of one right answer to these questions. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing that with some hard work in your study that you can't catch up. We're all starting in law school. We're starting over. And so I just kept thinking, well, learn from them, but don't doubt that you have the intelligence to keep up. So I applied myself, and in the States, law school is a separate degree. It's a separate 3-year degree after you finish your bachelor's degree. And so all of these people who were in my law class had already finished a bachelor's degree, and some of them from, the world-famous universities who had ended up at my law school, which has and still has a really good reputation. And things they would talk about, I thought, wow, how am I here and you're here at the same place at the same time? And I thought, well, it's because what matters is we both want to learn what this academic institution has to offer.
You mentioned there you went to law school at the University of West Virginia. I think it was founded by Thomas Jefferson, so I can only imagine how prestigious this place is.
Well, it was the University of Virginia in Charlottesville instead of West Virginia, because we'd moved to Virginia by that time. But yes, it was founded by Thomas Jefferson, and the Kennedys went there, and it was regarded as sort of the best law school outside Harvard.
Did you feel like an outsider, or by the time you finished your undergraduate studies, you thought, I absolutely belong here?
No, I still felt like an outsider. I might have known a couple of people who had also come from my undergraduate school, but we weren't close friends. And so in a way, that's sort of helpful. I didn't think I could sort of force my friendship on people. I made a couple of friends, but more because we ended up working at the same law firm after law school than because we were friends there. And I remember thinking that I just need to get on and learn as much as I can and make good grades, and that's what's going to hold me in good stead. And people did extend the hand of friendship, but the things that they would say, oh, we're all going to the islands for the break. Do you want to go? And I was thinking, no, I have a part-time job. I think I'm going to be working.
My yacht is busy that weekend.
That's right. The private plane is caught up somewhere. And I thought that is a world that I thought was only from the movies. But in the end, I thought we all sit down, we all write the same paper, and we're here to learn, and I'm here to make the best grades I can so I can hopefully get a good job.
It's at this time that you also get married, and I'm just wondering how a young person is dealing with being at law school and getting married at the same time. Because, of course, we now get married a little later, but you're juggling all of that at once.
Yeah, it wasn't unusual then. So it wasn't as if that was something that stood out. There were also, when I was in law school, a number of people who had come back from Vietnam who had a military career and decided to apply to law school. And so some of them had, families already as well as being married. So I didn't stand out in that way, but I wouldn't recommend personally to think that at 21 you're equipped to handle all of that at the same time. But you sort of think, well, other people are. Well, I could handle this too. And, you do. You do what you have to do. And it was, in a way, kind of nice to have someone that you could have, a social life and a personal life that didn't rely on becoming friends with the people who went to the islands on the holidays.
Although he was from a reasonably wealthy family, so
he
was
he
that
was.
in any way controversial?
You mean me?
Yeah, I guess for his family.
Oh yes, it was. It was, and if anything, he knew more people in that world and had gone to the debutante parties and the black tie things. Like I say, I thought that was just all fabricated stories until I found out all that was true. And it was a life that was just so foreign to me, but it says something that wasn't a life that he wanted either necessarily. So, but yes, it was a bit difficult for the in-laws.
Then you jumped straight into this very blokey world of law firms after university. How did the men around you treat you as one of the few female lawyers at the time?
The firm that I started with, I was the only female lawyer, and I was the first that they had hired in their 100-year history.
Wow.
And there was no model to follow. There was nothing to copy. Even things as simple as what do you wear? And now there's sort of a corporate dress. There's a way that you look, even though with what happened during the pandemic, we're starting to relax a bit more. But back then, even going to find, a pantsuit to wear to work, there was just nothing like that. There were dress suits, but those were sort of mother the bride looking things.
Yes.
And you think, and then you're just starting out and you think, I don't have any money to buy those kinds of things. Yeah. And what shoes do you wear? And what do people expect you to do? And so it was a real uncertain sort of time. And I kept thinking, well, I guess I'll just learn what I can and see what happens. But I didn't know how uneasy the relationship was for a little while. And while I was doing the best that I could and trying to make friends and always interested in working hard and doing the right thing by my employer, it was as big an adjustment for them to have me along as for me to walk in there and try to somehow be different than the admin staff or the librarians, which were mostly women. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sort of way, but I needed to be taken the same as the young male lawyers who walked in. And they were fine. They had a few women at their school. But it was trying to create rules where there hadn't been any, or try to create a way of doing things or being, or how can you go from trying to fit in to feeling like you belong, which is a big step. And I felt for a long time I was just trying to fit in. I was trying to be like the young male lawyers. I was trying to be indistinguishable.
Which is something that if we were to fast forward another 20-something years and you find yourself in Australia in a another blokey culture, AFL football, yes, we're decades on, so things are a little different. But I wonder if the lessons that you learn about, do I try to fit in or is it okay to be different? Did you view it differently once you were at Richmond Football Club?
Oh, you hope that after the decades that pass, you know yourself a bit better and you have a little more confidence in your judgment and that you know your way in the world. And so I didn't make any attempt to fit in. And like at Richmond, I thought this is an opportunity when I was asked to join the board in 2005. And I'll just see if it goes okay. If it doesn't go okay, I'll just leave. I'm not going to persist with something that isn't working for me. And if this is just a token gesture on their part, well, I'll know that pretty early. And so I think it goes back to getting to know yourself well and not being caught up in the name of the job you have or the expectations of others. So that's the way that I've approached most things since those early lessons of who am I and what is this place, and do I try to fit in, because after a while you don't want to just be fitting in.
Yeah, it's that sense of sort of owning your outsider status in a way and going, it's actually okay, I'm different to everyone else. And in fact, that's a strength, which is interesting. In your 20s, you, of course, started travelling, as so many young people do. What can you tell me about that trip to Greece that you took?
Oh, well, my first trip to Greece was my first time out of the U.S., except for a trip to the islands.
On that famous yacht.
Not quite as interesting as that. I went to Jamaica, but it was right after one of the revolutions in the 80s, and you didn't really want to be there. Everybody had guns. So Greece, I went with a number of friends, and we met. We came from different locations. We met over there, and it was just a wonderful experience. Well, after the first day, when you have jet lag. Now I know that's what happens, but I was thinking, what have I done? I just feel terrible. I don't want to be here. And I was going for 2 whole weeks. I was using my entire vacation time in America. And I think, what do you do on the second week of a vacation? I've never taken that long off. So the first week I thought, you do the sightseeing. And the second week, you just go home, don't you?
There's a thing called relaxing, Peggy. The Americans don't understand.
Well, that's what I found out what happens in the second week is you just slow down and enjoy it. And actually, I went back to Greece. I liked it so much. A couple of years later, I was back, and I just one friend and we thought we'll try some different places. And it was into the second relaxing week, I think, that there were a couple of Aussie backpackers, the Australian big trip around the world and 6 months or a year and all that. And I was on the American 2-week vacation, and they were on their way to Gallipoli. And I remember them saying, we'll be in the States, in a few months and we'll get in touch. And he did. And a year later, we were married.
Amazing. And again, this is sort of a huge risk at this point, because you decide to move to Australia away from everyone you know, your career, your family. Was it a case of having to start over once you landed in Australia?
It was. It was, again, one of those times where you think, I've lost my confidence. I don't know how to do anything here. I don't know anyone here except the person I'm married to. And I had been traveling quite a bit by the time I moved to Australia, and I'd always wanted to live somewhere other than as a tourist, to really get into the culture of a place. But I didn't know that I would be moving someplace for the rest of my life. And I thought, well, I'll give it a try. And then when you think about what was happening at the time, there was no internet. There was no cheap phone calls back and forth. You did feel quite isolated. And when I arrived, I thought, how do I get requalified to practice law? And it took a little while to figure that out when you really don't have any inside information about that. And, of course, I'm thinking everything's on the Northern Hemisphere schedule. So if I arrive in August, school must be starting in September. And it was like, no, February. And I thought, well, okay, what am I going to do during that period of time?
This is a big risk for you. You've established yourself in the US. You've now found yourself a fish out of water. You can't even figure out how to requalify in law. You don't have many friends yet. Like, was there a point where you thought, I'm just going home? Like, how did you tell yourself, I can get through this?
Well, in many situations, I've said the worst thing that can happen is you fail. You know, you're not any good at this.
And but for most people, that would stop them. That thought, I could fail.
Yeah, well, I think that while your confidence might be temporarily shaken, I thought what I left and what I did before I'm doing this new thing was pretty good. It was okay with me. So if the worst that happens is I go back to doing that thing rather than this new thing that is exciting, but maybe it's going to teach me a lesson that that's not for you. That's when we had paper airplane tickets, and I used to keep a return flight ticket.
Insurance.
And I would see that Qantas plane come in early in the morning from the States, and I thought, I can run out to the airport. Maybe I can get the flight back. And the first time I did go back, it was Christmas after that first landing. And I must confess, when it landed in Los Angeles, I cried.
Yeah.
I just thought, and I kept thinking, but you're committed. Let's go with this, and at least got to get through and get a job and then judge it appropriately.
And one way, of course, to find your feet in this new country and to find your next great community and a cause and a passion all rolled into one is at the MCG of all places. Can you tell me about that very first AFL game you went to?
Yeah, I think it was 1993. And I remember the date because the Great Southern Stand at the MCG had been refurbished, and that was the first season it was open. And I was practicing law at Herbert Smith Free Hills by then, and another lawyer came and he said, so you've picked Richmond as your team because that's where I lived. And he said, you ought to meet my wife. You know, everybody's a fanatical supporter if you support Richmond. She's a fanatical Richmond supporter, and she should take you to a game. And she did, and I remember it was a beautiful April afternoon, and we played Melbourne and we lost, and it was just wonderful to see, even though we lost, and the sort of athleticism, the size of the ground. The crowd wasn't very big back then. It didn't attract the crowds that it does now, but it was still enough to feel like you were part of something, and I could walk there. And so that was it. And so little by little, it became sort of a priority to get to the game. And then it became, I think I'll go to the interstate games. And so it built and built. And I realized that was a real release from the day-to-day work, the really intense, relentless being in a big law firm, being a partner at a big law firm. And I just enjoyed going and being part of the crowd. I thought, this is an opportunity that I would never have had in America to see this up close. And this is what happens in Australia, and especially in Melbourne. Everybody has a team. So I picked a team, and I didn't know much about the game, but I thought, join a tipping competition, force yourself to learn, and I just loved it. I loved just the way that it looked, and the Tigers were my neighborhood team, and they were going through a tough time economically, and so I thought, I'll become a member of my local team, and I didn't know what that meant. People said, you should have been here when they were good. And I said, we'll be good again. I didn't realize how long it was going to take, but Once you pick a team, you never change.
And you had specialised in financial services and superannuation. You're a partner at the law firm Herbert and Smith. You decide to become much more involved in the football club. It's a club that you'd already loved and spent some time supporting. But how hard was it to make the decision to join the board in 2005?
It was a really terrible time economically for the club, and I thought, it's not going to be fun for a long time. But I thought I had something to offer, and I was going to be the first woman in this organization in that capacity. If I don't feel like I belong, if I feel like I'm trying to fit in, then I'll have an opportunity to just say, not for me, and you can select someone else. But I'll start and see what happens and see if I have what I think I could contribute, which is a bit of interest in governance and financial stability and culture.
Peggy, you stayed on for many more years through that financial turmoil, and eventually in 2013 you're elected president of the board, the first woman to ever lead the club or any AFL club. When did you first start thinking about the top job?
Well, the president then, Gary March, was entering his 9th year as president. He became president the year that I joined the board and had been great about starting to think longer term, about getting some of the building blocks in place. But after 9 years, and we didn't have term limits at the time, he had announced that he was not going to seek another appointment or election as president. But he encouraged me to think about it. And I did, and I thought, nobody's going to accept this. And then a couple of supporters said, have you thought about being president? And I thought, well, gee, if you sort of see me in that role, I think I can do it. It's more, is it the best thing for the club? I then thought, well, I'll say that I'm interested, and I'll present to the board, and then we'll just see what happens. And it took a little while as the board sorted out, because there were three of us who were interested. But in the end, the board elected me, all men, and I thought, well, they think that I can do it, and I think I can do it, and I don't think that anybody else is any better placed unless this doesn't go well, and then I can stand aside and they'll elect someone else, because you serve at the pleasure of the board.
You had obviously won people over by that point. You'd been sitting on the board for a long time and very firmly entrenched at Richmond. But was there still a sense of the boys' club in the sport more generally? Like, how were you treated as a woman, an American one, a quiet operator? How were you treated when you took on that presidency?
I look back and think I was pretty naive to think it wouldn't be a big deal. But surprisingly, a number of people took exception to the American part more than to the woman part. But I realize now that I was such an outsider that nobody knew me. And so people sort of filled in the blanks with who they thought I was or what I would be. And I think that's because I didn't go to school with any of the people. I didn't have a family here. I didn't have any sisters who married footballers or football brothers who married somebody's sister. And there's a lot of that goes on because football's such a big thing here, and it's gone on for generations. And so there's a lot of integration of all those families. And in a way, I look back and think, but because I didn't know who anyone was, it meant that I didn't feel beholden to anybody either. And so I just was making decisions or trying to bring the board along in an evidence-based, factual kind of way. And so I spent quite a bit of time just getting to know people. I mean, going to supporter groups, speaking, and I didn't go out and have press conferences, but I spent a lot of time trying to meet people who had given a lot of their lives, a lot of volunteer hours, a lot of long-term employees at the club that I'd only had very tangential relationships with or none. And, who were our famous players that were just, mythical figures to me because I'm a fan first and foremost. But I got to meet them, and I got to sit with them, and I got to know them, and they got to know me. And then I found a great reservoir of support because I think in the end, they probably recognized I hope they recognized that I was doing it for what I thought was the long-term good of the club, and I wanted decisions to be based around that.
From Dead Set Studios, this is Curveball, and I'm Kelly Reardon. My guest is Richmond Football Club President Peggy O'Neal. She's the kind of leader who's built a career out of good governance and a solid strategy. And she joined the board of the Richmond Football Club in 2005 when the club was struggling. In 2016, though, Peggy, you faced quite a curveball, an attempted board takeover. What happened?
2014, we got off to a really bad start, and it was a famous year. We had to win 9 games in a row to get into finals, and we did at the end of the season. And so we're in finals again, and we lost. And 2015, we started out much better, and we're in finals again, and we lost. And the CEO and I were talking that there's something not quite right. We're good, and we're very competitive now, but we're not winning finals. And so the coach who had been with us since hired him in 2009, and he had taken us to finals 2013, 14, 15. And the decision before the board was whether we should extend his contract. So we took our time. We asked the head of football and the CEO to analyze the coach's performance, come back to the board. We took, I think, about 4 months of talking about it, taking our time, and decided in the end, based on that kind of data, is he was the person that we wanted, and we thought that it was important to make a statement that he was going to be there not for a 1-year extension, but for a 2-year extension. And we did discuss, well, what if we go backwards? What if 2016 is a terrible year? And we thought, well, we'll just have to ride that out because we still think he's the one. The players play for him. He's a great coach of young men. We just re-signed a number of players who were important players for us, and we thought they did it on the strength of him being their coach. We can't now sort of say, well, maybe he won't be.
Can I also ask you about a course at Harvard that you sent a couple of the people from your club to? Because I think it's a course that a few Australian leaders have now done about authentic leadership. What difference did that make to Damien Hardwick?
Well, in 2016, I caught up with people for some moral support and a cup of coffee, and they had both separately come back from Harvard Business School taking a course on authentic leadership called True North that Bill George designed, and he was one of the early academics who started studying leadership as a business subject. And I looked into it, and I thought, I'm going to talk to the CEO about this. And I'd long sort of questioned why, when season's over, most coaches, assistant coaches, football department, takes their break, and a lot of them go overseas and look at stadiums. And I thought, well, where's the personal development in this? That's the professional development. But what about the personal development? And our coach is a real data-driven kind of person, and he wasn't really crazy about going, but he did, and it gave him a new way of thinking about what a leader should be and how he could be more true to himself, because he was following, I think, in modeling himself on what he had seen before, and it wasn't working. And he's talked quite a bit now about what was going on at that time. He thought if you just, the numbers will give you the answer. If you just look at the data, you look at data. But what we were hearing from, around the traps was people wanted more of him. They wanted the relationship. And I remember he came back from that course and he did the end of the season sort of summary for the board. And he started talking about that course and what it meant to him and how he had found new things to inform next year. And it's one thing to, lots of people take courses, but it's another thing to make it change you or to believe it so deeply that you want to change the way you do things. And sure enough, a lot of that was, we're not going to be perfect. We're going to go out there and do the best we can. We're going to accept that not all of us are of the same mold. And the more you know about the people you work with, the more likely you are to help. You might think, well, now I know why that was a really they were really grumpy for that period of time is I didn't know their dad was sick. I didn't know that. But I could have helped you. So now they would give permission to say, I'm having a tough time and I need your help. But then after that, Damien went back the next year to Harvard for another course. He went to London Business School the next year. And so I think it was not the only solution, but it was a big piece of the puzzle that hadn't always been addressed. And that flowed through to our captain, who took it and ran with it. And Brene Brown, the great leader, was over in Australia doing a course for people in 2019. She came to our game.
Amazing.
And she's mentioned it 2 or 3 times in her podcast about how different it was and how much she enjoyed it. So it's always nice we think that we're doing the right thing and emphasizing the value of all our people. But for outsiders to think that we're on the right path, it means you have to be ever vigilant. But I think that's made us a different place to work. But back to your question, what happened in 2016 is we didn't do well. We were on our way to not even making finals, which we didn't. And some people got impatient. There was a little bit of, we knew that would happen when you had a woman who didn't play football. And so there were like 3 groups who came out separately and said, we want you to leave the board. You could take the coach with you while you're on your way. And it was like, well, I just don't think that's going to happen. And while there's a lot of media and people like to see bad things happen, and there's Richmond, and this is what they do all the time. They're always destroying each other. And here's just another example. They'll start another 5-year plan. And I do remember saying, if we keep starting over, we'll always be starting over. If we change now, why don't we see this through? We made it on solid, evidence that this was the thing to do. And you don't get rid of people in business if they have a bad quarter in sales or something, unless there's something else wrong. If the fundamentals are right, you give people a chance. So we, as a board, the board was very united in saying, well, whatever you think, you go deal with them. And so the CEO and I did, and just went back to the principles of we've been elected to do a job. The members elect the board, and the board elects the president. And until someone else gets elected, we'll just keep doing our job. And if someone wants to have an extraordinary general meeting and go through all of that, well, that's fine too. If someone else gets elected, I'm happy to go back to watching football. And over time, they all, one by one, disappeared. I'm sure there was hard feelings, and it was something that we wished hadn't happened, but it did. And I don't know that in that winter when all that was going on that I was thinking, we'll just wait, next year we'll win a grand final. But that's what happened.
You were so steely in your focus at that point, though. There are other people that, may have collapsed during that or second-guessed their decisions. What did it feel like personally to have your leadership challenged so publicly?
Well, no one likes to be scrutinized in a way that, deep down I thought was unfair. Because at the same time, none of the people who were suddenly, concerned that I leave had ever come and discussed their concerns with me. And I thought, well, we talked about it, you might have understood a bit more about what was going on in the background. I'm not sharing this publicly, but I would have told you that we are taking action and we aren't just letting things run as they are, that all of us want to be successful. And so that was concerning to me, that I didn't have a chance to explain or persuade and so that's what it came back to. We've been elected to do a job, and this is our job. But also it was a great sense of power to have such a united board behind me. And I think that taking our time and making those decisions, and everyone had agreed on the important decision about extending the coach's contract, there was no room for someone to say, oh, that was just you, or I didn't get to have my say, or you rushed it. So I think that all of that also makes me realize there's very little in football that can't wait till the next day. When behind the scenes, there's nothing that is urgent. it's rare that anything is urgent.
I feel like that's that alone is such a great lesson, because in a modern media age and there's so much scrutiny on everything and things move so fast, I think as leaders, we all feel very pressured to make fast decisions. But that sense of calm, steady, measured approach being so valuable.
Well, that's a lesson I learned through this and I remember thinking, they can't make us announce something until we're ready. They can't make us do that. We can trip ourselves up here by going out and saying something to quell the media crowd, but that's not fair to the supporters, and it's not fair to all the people who are working hard to come up with a plan. And it's easier to react than to plan. And we were trying to come up with something that made sense, that could help everyone, and that we could then take the next step up from just getting into finals. But through 2016, I think it was the power of unity. Because had the board splintered, I just don't know how we would have been able to manage the media too, because there was a lot of poking around among my fellow directors. But had someone decided that it was, I'm going to go and leak something, or I'm going to do, and I'll calm things down. I'll just tell them what we're working on. But that never happened, and that period of trust that was built during all of that still holds us in good stead now. And I think it just became, this is Richmond now. It isn't the old Richmond of, let's beat each other up and eat our own, as they say. That we're going to go about this in a more deliberate kind of way with the long-term good of the club in mind.
You go on, of course, to clinch that 2017 premiership.
Yay!
Must have felt pretty great.
Well, I can't say that we knew it was going to happen, but when during the preseason, the players and staff who had been on the preseason camp were saying, it feels different this year. Boy, it's really fun. Really. It just is so different than last year. And sometimes, what we've been hearing a lot lately in the last 12 months is never waste a crisis to make some changes. And so it makes you, I think, when things are going well or okay, you don't have to dig deep sometimes. But when things are going not well, sometimes you have to face things you haven't wanted to or have been sort of buried under this is good enough. And the whole point of what we went to, our performance excellence project is what we called it. It just uncovered things that we're up for this, we can do this. And so we were committed to following through on all those things to get us to the next level. But when 2017 happened, and I still remember, I think we lost 3 games in a row by less than a goal. And it was like, oh, here we go again. And but then by the middle of the season, it's like, oh, wow, they look good. Wow, look at this. And did I know we were going to win a grand final? I thought, by the time we got to the middle of August, I thought, if we can win the qualifying final against Geelong, I think we can win. And we did. So it was thrilling, but I was in shock, and I did not anticipate the emotional drain that it took. It was happy, but it was pretty exhausting too, because it just, the floodwaters had broken over the dam walls after 37 years.
Well, I mean, you could draw a direct line as well from 2016 coming out of that to win the premiership in 2017. I think must have felt particularly great. But it speaks to this sense of culture and leadership and trying to change and modernise the club. And you've always been very clear about it's not your job to coach the team. There's people who do those key roles, and you need to let them do that. But what about when things like the groping scandal happens, and there's it's players, they're involved, there's a sense of what's happening in locker rooms, which you're not really part of. But what do you then do as a leader to show what's the acceptable standard in 2020, 2021?
Again, we as a board had decided some time ago, before we had an actual case, that we ought to determine how we would handle misbehavior across the whole club, players and staff, because players get a lot of focus, but the admin staff side of things is there are more people there than in the football department. So anyway, it was going to be across, and And there were issues at other clubs at the time, and we started talking about, well, how would we handle that? And we actually had been working with an ethicist to come in and do some hypotheticals just to get us sort of thinking about these sorts of issues. So we thought, well, before we have an actual emotional situation, let's come up with the way we're going to handle things. And, if it's criminal is one thing. If it's misbehavior that doesn't arise to criminal, what are we going to do with that? If it's a staff member, we have certain HR policies, but then the players are under contracts that are different and have some terms dictated by the AFL Players Association. So it's not a normal workplace. There are lots of moving parts. So we came up with a method of how we wanted to handle things, and so that was sort of the framework. But then when you have an actual situation, there's the element of disappointment, the element of I do know the people, and that's sometimes a reason that being a bit removed gives you a lot more gravitas when it comes to something that's like, oh, well, now the president's coming in, because that's not the usual way when things get quite serious. But I think that we as a club aren't immune from all of the societal things that happen. And in a way, it's determining if character has a fatal flaw or if this is a mistake. And that applies whether you're a player or someone else. There are some things that just are not acceptable at all. There are other things that we have to work through the AFL Players Association, and the AFL has its own enforcement and investigation unit. So it's sometimes simplistic to say, well, just fire them. Because lots of times that isn't possible, and lots of times that isn't indicated, and lots of times that's the emotion of the moment. And lots of times you have to take into account not just the player, but all the people around them, including the other person who's involved who has a complaint. So it's sort of like being a judge and a jury. You have to weigh up a lot of factors, but it comes back to what do we stand for, and we're also think it's important to give people second chances if they can prove that they deserve a second chance. And that's held us in good stead with a lot of people who have appreciated that, built trust again, and have never done anything wrong after that. So it's you're dealing with a lot of young people in a very high-profile situation.
But I can think the thing that's challenging,
Mm-hmm.
though, is there's the expectations in the workplace. What happens in the football club with the kind of capital A administration. But a locker room is also a workplace, but has a different kind of code. Would you say, or would you say now we expect the same things there? I mean, there's so many things that go on in a locker room, swearing or, whatever.
Well, I think that there are certain elements of respect that apply wherever you are. And I think we also have to think that, there's now in many sport a viable women's competition, and that respect has to be given in the same way, no matter where you are in the no matter what room you're working in that organization, that the same rules ought to apply, and ought to apply from from the football people to administration, the respect that they give to each other, the realization that all those roles are important and all those people are important, and that we need to treat each other as we would like to be treated. That's what it comes down to. So absolutely, those same rules should apply in locker rooms, and by and large, they are observed very strictly. Doesn't mean always, as we know.
What about the Women's League? How involved are you in it? And is there going to be a time when female players take home the same pay packet and the media coverage and the sponsorship that the men do?
Well, we applied for an AFLW team the first year that it was available to do so, and we got rejected, and which was very disappointing to us. And so we then went and obtained a license to have a VFLW team to start, women playing and start to build. And we brought in a head of women's football, who Kate Sheehan, who still works with us. And we then applied again and got rejected again, and because it was a limited rollout. So we've only had a team for 2020, which had an abbreviated season because of COVID, and then 2021. But I go to as many games as I can. I love it. And I love the vitality and the difference that it makes around the club. We're just a better club to have women in those kinds of numbers working there as athletes. We've had a great number of women working there in other roles. But when you were talking about respect, the male and female athletes respect each other as athletes. And that's really good to see. But it's a different feel. It's a different game. It's trying to, or hearing criticism about, well, it doesn't look like the men's game. They don't run as fast. It's like, well, it's not that game. It's a different game. It has some of the same rules. It looks the same. But I think the skill level, as we can see, and this is only the 5th year of the competition, and it has come on so quickly. Just think if we have generations of people being exposed to great facilities, good coaching, how wonderful that's going to look very soon, because this year I think was just extraordinary to watch and to get the complete season. Are they going to get equal pay? Well, the AFLPA, that's a matter of negotiation with the clubs, but right now they're still playing sort of it's a part-time job. And I know in talking to some of the women players at Richmond and at other clubs, they really want to be full-time, and how that happens over time, because it is an expense. As it gets better and better and more sponsors, it'll be different. But it is an expense that has to be factored in. But I know the AFL is looking now at a big injection of money, and that next year I think will not only be longer, but will maybe be a bit different. But I think that they need to be provided with a wage that allows them, that while they're playing, to just play.
I will have my Brisbane moment here, because, of course, I heard the girls when they the Brisbane Lions won. But the girls were talking about, how many of them do have jobs, and that there was one, I think it was the captain, was talking about, her week looks like, training from 5 a.m., being at work at 9 a.m., leaving work at 5 p.m., training from 6 till 10 p.m., falling into bed at kind of 11 p.m. every night. And I think that, how can you be an elite athlete when you need sleep, things like that. So I really do hope that changes. Last season, of course, was plagued by the coronavirus pandemic. Players didn't like the hubs they had to be placed in. You couldn't have fans at the game. There's a scene from the Amazon documentary where you're sitting in the boardroom sort of early on with your CEO and your chief operating officer, and you're talking about the financial hit that you as a club were going to take, which I think was in the many millions of dollars. And this is when Richmond has won several premierships in the last few years. So you were probably a club that was best placed to take a financial hit. How did you navigate all of that through the last 12 months?
I remember those scenes. It's interesting to go to look at how scared we all were for good reason.
Yeah.
And it was so many unknowns, and it was just this, so vague as to when will we play again, or would we play again, or are we going to get on top of this? Are people going to die? It was awful. But it was changing from, well, here are the projections if we don't play at all this year. Here are the projections if we get 8 games in. And here are the projections if we have 8 games with no people there. Or if we all go to a hub and we can have 5,000 people there. So there was a lot of that, just modeling on what's worst case, what's a little bit better, what's a little bit better. And then, of course, we're looking at people losing their jobs because there was nothing that was going on in Victoria. So it was a tremendous effort by management to stay on top of the money. And like you say, we were in a situation where we were probably as well placed as any club to know that this wasn't going to sink us, and that we were going to be able to get through under our own steam without having to go to the AFL or to our banks to ask for money, because we were we're still very cautious in budgeting, and we've saved what we can, and so we knew that was going to be okay. But there was the huge, personal toll as well as the financial toll. But management, our CEO and our chief operations officer, and the head of people, and it was just a huge effort to keep people feeling safe and communicating well about what was going on, even though we didn't know, and thinking, well, we can have a Zoom or a Teams conference right now, but in 3 hours it may be totally different. We don't know what's going to happen, and then things just went quiet for a very long time, and then in June we started up again, and then it was, well, now everybody's going to go to Queensland, and what's that going to look like? And so I think it was a bit of, what do we know now, and what's held us in good stead, and a bit of that, steady, unhurried decision making, and let's give it a bit of time to settle. But at the same time, knowing that people were very nervous, very anxious, and trying to provide support where you could. And I thought they did a fantastic job of providing support and taking on a huge emotional toll themselves just to get through that side.
Finally, Peggy O'Neal, I'd love to know what's next for you. You've said you'll finish after this term with the club. What else tickles your fancy to do next?
You're right. I have this season and next season, and I'll finish up, and it'll be somebody else's turn to have fun. I'm not really sure. I've been approached about writing a book, and I might. I've saved all my speeches and all the clippings, even those dark times where I just folded newspapers up and put them in a big container, saying someday I'll read these with hindsight and see what they're like. But something will come along. I've taken on a couple of new board roles this year, and that's interesting just to meet new people and do new things. And I think my approach has always been just realize when a door's opening, and I've been fortunate to have a number of doors open for me, and walk through, see what happens. So I'd love to take time to write a novel that I've been working on off and on for a while, about sort of based in where I grew up. And then there's always the Richmond side of things that I've started to think about. Can I make something out of this? But I'm not sure I could tell everything that happened. But for my for myself, I think it would be nice to have the recollections all put down in a formal way somewhere along the way. And so maybe that's what I'll do starting in 2023.
Well, congratulations on a stellar career. I hope you managed to pick up 2 more flags before,
Thanks.
before you leave Richmond. But thank you also for sharing your journey. I think some of the quiet, more humble leaders, sometimes not always the ones who get the oxygen. So it's been great to get inside your mind on Curveball. Thank you.
Oh, you're more than welcome.
Curveball's a production of Dead Set Studios, a global podcast consultancy. And I'd love to hear what you guys think of Curveball. Just open whichever podcast app you're listening in right now and leave us a rating and a review. It really helps other people find the show. But you can also shoot me an email or suggest a guest. You can email it to hello@deadsetstudios.com, or you can visit our website, curveballshow.com. And make sure you're following Curveball so you always know when a brand new nugget of leadership goodness is there in your podcast feed. And that way you won't miss our next guest.
I was gaining confidence as a person. I was finding out who the real me was, and I thought, well, I'm going to actually go out on my own and open my own corporate travel agency. Probably took me about 3 to 5 years to really get on a roll with that place. It's a tough business to work in.
That's next on Curveball. The executive producers on this episode, myself and Rachel Fountain. And thanks to Carl Hitchmo at iHeartRadio and ARN for studio recordings.